Now, let's take a look at setup mode. Setup mode allows you to take up to 8 programs on 8 different MIDI channels and split or layer them in zones across the keyboard. If you call up a setup which uses 3 zones or less, then the left part of the display will show the programs for each zone. Lines under the program name show where each zone is laid out on the keyboard. In this setup, you can see that School Bass is assigned to the left side of the keyboard, and FMish E-piano and Dyn E-piano are layered on the right. You can also see the MIDI channel for each zone. If the setup has more than 3 zones, then you will still see the lines showing in the keyboard layout, but the program names are not displayed. Before we proceed any further, we need to talk about one parameter which will be important if you have the rack module. It's called Local Keyboard Channel, and it's found on the MIDI Receive page. To get to it, press the MIDI Mode button, then the soft button labeled Receive. You will need to use this parameter if you want to use setup mode. It is important to understand that a setup is designed to transmit information. On the keyboard version of the 2600, the keyboard itself will transmit on up to 8 channels when in setup mode. But with the rack, if your keyboard only sends information on 1 MIDI channel, you need a way to turn that information on 1 channel into 8 channels. This is what the local keyboard channel parameter does. It takes the signal coming in 1 channel and turns it into different information, depending on where you are in the 2600. To demonstrate, set local keyboard channel to 1, and then send from your keyboard on channel 1. Now, go back to setup mode, and let's look at our setup again. The information coming in on channel 1 from your keyboard stays on channel 1, or is turned into channel 2 and 3, depending on where I play on the keyboard. It's important to understand that the local keyboard channel will change the way the 2600 performs in other modes as well. It changes the incoming information depending on what you have displayed in the 2600. For instance, if you're in program mode with channel 5 in the display, then the information coming in on channel 1 will be turned into channel 5, and you will hear the program assigned to channel 5. But if you turn local keyboard channel off by setting it to none, then if you send on channel 1, you will hear the program that is assigned to channel 1, even if you are looking at channel 5. Local keyboard does more than just change the MIDI channel. You will notice that the octave plus and minus soft buttons now will transpose the information. And you can even use it to change one type of MIDI controller to another. For more information on this, consult your manual. Once again, I want to point out that this parameter is normally used only by rack owners. If you have the keyboard, you should leave the local keyboard channel set to none. Now, let's take a look at some of the things you can do with the setup. I've already shown you a setup using a basic splitting and layering. Here is one of my performance setups that I use in the Rudess Morgenstein project, with many different programs laid out across the keyboard, and a surprise on the ribbon. For each zone in a setup, you can assign any controller to send any message you want. You can even use the same slider to send up to 8 different messages by assigning a different controller number to each zone. Here is a setup which has 5 zones, each using the same string program, but with each zone transposed to a different octave. By assigning each slider to control volume for one zone, I can constantly change the timbre of the string ensemble. Now let's look at some cool things you can do with the ribbons. One typical use is to use it to control pitch, which is the default setting when you're playing programs. but it can be used for many other things. Here I've used the big ribbon to crossfade between 3 different zones. I've used a different curve for each zone. One is set to crossfade, one to reverse crossfade, and the third to bump. So each spot on the ribbon gives a different mix of the 3 programs. You can also trigger notes from the ribbon, as well as other controllers. So I can play harp arpeggios on the ribbon while playing another sound on the keyboard. Another thing you can do in a setup is control the arpeggiator. The arpeggiator takes notes that you play on the keyboard and turns them into arpeggiated patterns. In the next setup, I have one of the Latin percussion programs set to arpeggiate, which creates all different kinds of percussive grooves as I play on the keyboard. I can hold the groove with the pedal and then play notes over that groove. In this setup, I'm bringing in the volume of the arpeggiated sound with the ribbon. A setup allows you to call up a song when you select that setup. This is great for performance. You can simply call up the setup you want, and it will call up one of your songs, and at the same time, you call up the programs that you want to play live from the keyboard. At that point, you can press the dedicated play button, or if you have a rack, press the left and right cursor buttons together, and the song will start playing, and you can play along with it. The K2600 also contains some special groove template setups, which we created by using the ability to trigger songs from keys. You'll learn about this in the song mode section of this video. This allows you to have an automatic accompaniment pattern which will switch keys as you play different notes with your left hand while playing a melody with your right hand. We hope that these examples have given you some ideas about the many capabilities that you have with setups in the 2600. In the next section, we'll show you how to build a simple setup.